Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Well Said, where I interview policy experts, commentators, academics, students, activists, and others on topics of higher education, free speech, and other related topics in American culture and policy. You can share this episode on Facebook or YouTube, as well as on any podcast platform such as Apple, Spotify, Anchor, Ricochet. Download the episode and listen anytime. If you like what you heard today, give our podcast a 5-star rating and go to our website, speechfirst.org, and press donate. Today on our show, David Bernstein joins us to discuss ever relevant topics on issues that he actually outlines in his book. I have it here, Woke Anti-Semitism, How Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. As we have seen the horrific acts by Hamas on the people of Israel, and we brace ourselves for what could be one of the bloodiest wars in the region, Americans have taken notice of the reactions of our university leadership and our college students, who are in some cases actually defending the actions of Hamas and they continue to advocate for more actions by Hamas. So as shocking as this may seem to many who have not been following the sentiments and culture issues on college campuses, I think David and I are honestly not too surprised. If you'll recall previous episodes of Well Said, we've covered the anti-Semitism found in DEI departments on campuses across the country, as well as trying to understand why college campuses have been overtaken by various political movements, such as the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Initiative against Israel. So while trying to understand how these political movements are able to grow and ferment on college campuses, we must first understand how and why traditionally liberal institutions are susceptible to anti-Semitic sentiments to begin with. So thank you, David, for joining us. I'm looking forward to having this conversation and really digging into to the history here and the origins of some of these thoughts. So let's get into this. Let's start talking about it. First, I want to ask you kind of like what initiated the writing of this book? Like, what did you see happening on campuses or in institutions that drove you to really want to not only put it down in a book, but also start to realize that no one else was seeing this and that you needed to write about it?
Yeah. So, I've been actually on the center left side of the Jewish world my entire life. I've run Jewish advocacy organizations. I've stood up for certain ideas around criminal justice reform and church-state separation and same-sex marriage and the like. And so I watched with interest what happens in my own backyard, my own ideological backyard. And going back even more than 20 years ago, I started to see some serious warning signs on the left. In the late 1990s, I was a young staffer at that time. I was part of this leadership group, and we had 2 days of multiculturalism. And in those days, there was no DEI in those days. It was just multiculturalism, and I was kind of psyched for it. I thought it was going to be an interesting couple of days, and I was stunned at what actually happened. They started out by saying that racism equals prejudice plus power. And I thought to myself, wait a second, I always thought that racism was just animus towards another minority group. And yet here we were told that, that this was the new definition of racism. And that it meant for me that Jews would be associated with people in power. And so therefore they couldn't be victims of racism. And that any group that's perceived as being powerless will not be viewed as a perpetrator. And I wrote about it even in the early 2000s. And I warned the Jewish community, if this stuff catches on, we're going to be in trouble. But I also worried that it was illiberal in a basic sense. I warned colleagues about it over and over. In 2016, I think I wrote the first major sort of popular op-ed about intersectionality in the Jewish community. And I warned that if this idea, as it's being presented now, continues to catch on, we're going to be in trouble. And the response was just fast and furious. There were like 9 op-eds condemning me for my views on it, and I thought, okay, wow, I've struck a nerve here. And then of course there was the great reckoning after George Floyd, and I started to see really deep-seated examples of this within the Jewish community itself, and that made me even more nervous. And I left in February 2021, and shortly thereafter founded the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, pushed back against this ideology in the Jewish world. And at that very time when I started in May 2021, there was a war with Hamas. And I realized that Israel was being given no benefit of the doubt at all. In previous conflicts, like Israel usually had like 3 days in which the mainstream press would give it the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, of course it has to respond to Gaza rocket fire. But then, of course, there would be some casualties and Israel would be reined in and the like. That didn't happen in 2021. I knew that something else was afoot. And so that's why when I knew I had to write the book.
Right. That's kind of really interesting. And I'm kind of curious. So where did you want to start when you were thinking about this book? Did you initially say like I've got to like trace the origins all the way back to like this like Marxist ideology, like go even further back in history, or were you initially just setting out to just kind of explain the current phenomenon? And I'm just kind of curious how the concepts developed, because most of your book is actually about how the institutions were taken over. So I'm kind of curious how, as you started the research, this kept going further and further back.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I had read along the way Cynical Theories, which is by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, which
Great
really
book.
goes into the nature of the ideology itself and how it developed and the various forms it takes. And so I had read that well before I had written my book, so I had some inkling of it. I had also read a very important essay by Tammy Rossman Benjamin, was a professor at UC Santa Cruz, and she's an activist now, fighting back against these trends on college campuses. And she had written an essay about the long march through institutions, how these sort of postmodernist philosophers and ideologues were able to take over institutions starting, let's say, in the late 1960s. 1968 was a critical year. And so I saw that piece and I included a lot of that in my analysis as well, because I realized that's why, for example, we're dealing with ethnic studies in California's K through 12 system and now spreading around the country. It's because these professors started with universities, got these ideas embedded, and then they use that to proselytize K through 12 schools as well.
Yeah, and so can you walk us through a little bit just some of the connections between this kind of Marxist ideology, this Marxist worldview, and how what the connection is with anti-Semitic outlooks? Because I think this is where this is an important part to understand, but it's also not often connected for a lot of folks directly.
Sure. So I see what we're facing, whether we call it woke ideology or critical social justice ideology, whatever we want to call it, as being built upon a Marxist framework, but not being Marxism. I mean, there are Marxists that I know who cannot stand wokeism. They think it is a fundamental, twisting, distortion of Marxism, and they can't, and they push back against it. Freddie Dubois is one of them. Batya Ungar-Sargon, I think, also regards herself as a Marxist in the old sense. So, what it was is you had people like Herbert Marcuse and others who were postmodern philosophers and also Marxists who understood that America was not going to be overthrown in a violent revolution, and that's why they introduced ideas like the Long March through the institutions. So that was a departure already, and they changed sort of the framework from, proletariat and bourgeoisie to sort of race and gender and the like. And they thought that would be more likely to move people in that direction. And that caught on over time. Of course, they've been remarkably successful in their march through institutions. What this does is it lays out a very clear understanding of who has power and who doesn't, and therefore who has agency and who doesn't, and therefore who can be the oppressor and who is going to be the oppressed. It lays out a very clear linkage between one's identity and one's oppression or privilege. And I think in that rigidity itself, you end up this idea that Jews who succeed on average more than many other ethnic minority communities must be part of the oppressed class, because it's the only allowable explanation. If the only way that you're able to look at disparity and say, if this is a function of oppression or discrimination, then how else can one minority do better than another minority, if not for complicity in white supremacy or whatever? And I think that's why you end up inexorably with anti-Semitism, because Jews are perceived as, on average, economically successful, or on average as educationally successful, and so you have to conclude then that's why they're successful. They're doing it on the backs of other minorities.
Right, and I think So let's connect this to Israel too, because I think where there's also a lot of confusion is
Yes.
the connection of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And in most cases, the overlap that is, in my opinion, anti-Zionism is used as a way to cloak anti-Semitism so people can get away with expressing that
Yes.
sentiment. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on how this leftist progressive ideology connects those two to one
Yes.
another. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because there's another dimension here that also took shape in the late 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
After Israel won decisively in 1967 Six-Day War, the Soviet Union launched an anti-Zionist campaign in order to discredit Zionism. They actually invented a field called Zionology, which was how Zionism was this oppressive ideology and the like. And they wrote books about it, highly popular books.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
that then led to, sort of the Zionism as racism idea. And that was popular in post-colonial circles too. So they influenced post-colonial thought as well, which is really what we're talking about here. It's like wokeism is post-colonialism applied domestically. It's this idea that the global north oppresses the global south, or that the once colonial powers are still engaging in their colonial project through ideas and knowledge and dissemination and the like. So you had really a deeply influenced left that came out of the Soviet Union and the Soviet experience and their attacks on Zionism. And that's why I think Zionism and Israelis are viewed as sort of the paradigmatic oppressors, right? They're viewed as a colonial project. They can't see them otherwise. So that's deeply embedded. And in some ways, Zionism is almost like the key litmus test for being part of the intersectional left. Like you have to agree with us on that one question if you're going to be part of the club. And so Israel is just swept into that worldview. And is treated as the perennial oppressor. And if you start out believing that, then you cannot believe anything else. So that's why the professors of ethnic studies, like there's something called the Coalition for Ethnic Studies, Liberated Ethnic Studies. They were sending out memes before the blood had even dried on the pavement in Israel.
Yeah.
They were sending out memes, that were praising the Palestinian resistance, which is a code word for Hamas's murderous terrorist attacks. And it comes out of that ideology, like Israel must be the oppressor because it is always the oppressor. It is the colonial power that is oppressing them. So anything that the oppressed does is resistance, and anything the oppressor does, no matter how humane, is oppressive.
So you mentioned the actors on campuses who are, in a lot of ways, they are administrators or faculty members who are kind of leading the charge here. But I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on. There's a lot of students who, and maybe I'm wrong here, but who aren't Palestinian on campuses, who are in this, who kind of swept up into this far left movement. Is there any? What are your thoughts on how these students kind of get swept into pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas rallies, even after all the evidence is exposed? And I know you kind of touched on some of these themes in your previous comments, but I guess it's like, I can understand why a Palestinian themselves would want to go advocate for this thing because it is their home, their country. But I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are on the others is it just willful ignorance, or is there something else more going on here?
I mean, there is willful ignorance involved for sure. But I think going back to that idea that either you're the oppressed or the oppressor, and going back to this idea that only people with lived experience of oppression get to define the world for you. If that's your ideology, and in some ways that's what wokeism is an ideology. It's that says that the oppressed get to define their condition for everyone else, and we have to defer to that. It's sometimes referred to as identitarian deference. So let's say you are part of the Harvard progressive community, okay? And you work together on issues from climate change to sex violence on campus and so forth. And one of your member groups, let's say a Students for Justice in Palestine, says Israel is responsible for this. The tendency will be, because they're the oppressed voice, to go along with their perspective because they have lived experience. and we should defer to lived experience. And in this case, it's Palestinian lived experience is going to take you a long way. So even if you might be mortified at what you saw and you're another student group, and that initial foray, you might say, well, we have to go by the lived experience of our allies in this Students for Justice in Palestine.
Right.
You saw this phenomenon a bit with the Democratic Socialists of America, where their initial response was to completely justify everything that the Hamas murderers just did in Israel. And then later, there was sort of a secondary response from many people like, well, maybe we shouldn't have gone that far. Yeah. Some people resigned and the like. Do I think that initial response from the Democratic Socialists of America represented everybody in their ranks, or even most? Probably not. I didn't do a poll, but I would think that a lot of people probably would have had qualms about it, but they feel frozen in the face of these allegations from people who they're supposed to defer to. Right. And that's where I think the phenomenon you're seeing on campuses as well.
Because everything is such a black and white dichotomy, like you're either for the oppressed group or you're for the oppressor group, and there's no room for nuance.
Who's demanding it of you matters,
right?
It's not just what you think and in the ideology, but if somebody who's oppressor says you have to think this way, then you have to think this way.
Yeah.
And you have to be an ally, because to them.
And so, this is so interesting because I feel like there are a lot of students who, again, like, are just kind of captured by this movement, and then suddenly they find themselves defending terrorists, and they really don't know how to get out of that. And, I talk a lot about, how this anti-Semitism has existed actually for a long time on college campuses, because we could talk about like how the left has, like we said, marched through the institutions, taken over the campus, and essentially kind of created these more friendly environments for things like anti-Semitism and other tyrannical viewpoints. But I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on this boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that has for years taken campuses by storm. Because again, it does seem that there's some additional connection here, whether it be from national organizations funding this or trying to influence it. But it seems like there are just so many more advocates for very specific political agendas like this one against Jews, against the state of Israel, that are a little above like the typical progressive, trope, essentially. So,
yeah, look, you have very motivated constituencies on a campus, right? You have both, Muslim Palestinian students who are there who have very strongly held views. You have professors who have been part of post-colonial movements and were inculcated in the anti-Zionist ideology, and it creates sort of a perfect storm on campus where Israel's becomes the the penultimate boogeyman of the left. And you have, by the way, money coming from places like Qatar, which funds specifically these.
That's kind of what I was alluding to. Yeah, I wanted you to talk about that.
Yeah. I mean, there's been, I heard the figure, something like $10 billion has come from Qatar in the last decade or so toward campuses. And there have been some forensic analysis of the money trail from Qatar to university campuses. I think that's a huge aspect of this, sometimes an underreported aspect of this. It's made complicated because the United States at least the current White House thinks that it has that Qatar is an important ally in some of its efforts. And so it's not willing to challenge them on some of these issues. But I think that that is certainly part of the dynamics. In some ways, Qatar is the new Saudi Arabia. Like after Saudi Arabia after 9/11, was clearly you had made peace with all these clerics who then went out and urged funding of these, of Al Qaeda and other terrorist causes, certainly Hamas. And Saudi Arabia understood that it had to go in a different direction. It did go into a different direction over a period of 20 years. Whereas Qatar now has been, has been funding from behind the scenes a lot of these causes, and has been fueling the ideological craziness on campus. And we've got to push back against that. I think we've got to call them out for that. We've got to find legislative ways, if possible, that are legal to challenge them.
Yeah, and I think this is something I was just talking to someone else about this too. How we're not calling them out, and it's actually a little ironic that Secretary Blinken wants to work with the Qataris on this, considering their level of support and overt support of Hamas. Honestly, like the headquarters, the leadership stays in Qatar under their protection. And again,
Yes.
like these billions of dollars that the last administration, the Trump administration, had actually done the forensic digging into the financials of a lot of foreign funding for universities and found these billions of dollars from Qatar specifically. That could be linked to, BDS initiatives or anti-Semitic professors on campus. But so I think you're absolutely right. They need to be called out. There needs to be some legislative action taken place. I'm a little harder on them than you are, in that I would say they're beyond Saudi Arabia, and that I put them closer to Iran in their complicitness in this, and that they try to play middleman. But they really are not neutral at all. And they are incredibly an anti-Semitic country, and they ultimately would rather get rid of Israel than, in my opinion, do like any kind of business deal with them, like Saudi Arabia is attempting to do right now.
And the crazy thing about Qatar, and the numbers are not perfect here, but there's something like 3 million people and only 300,000 real Qataris. So you have 300,000 people who, derive their wealth from oil, who are able to play such a disastrous role in America's intellectual life. And I think we should be stunned by that and push back against it accordingly.
Absolutely. Well, I'm glad we got to talk about that a little bit. I'm always welcome an opportunity to call out the Qataris on a podcast, because like you said, they don't get enough attention, and it's because they are professional lobbyists. This is what that country has built its exports around, is essentially their ability to lobby and to influence American and Western politics. Okay. So I did want to get into this a little bit more, because this is something I think a lot of people actually are curious about as well. When we're talking about the left's capture of Jewish institutions, first I want you to kind of walk us through like the various ways some of the institutions, the most important ones, they have actually been captured by the far left. But then also, can you answer the question, like, why are American Jews, especially American Jews, so attracted to liberal politics, especially after just looking at the blatant amount of anti-Jew rhetoric that's coming out of the left, just historically and even today?
Yeah. So a couple things. First, let me answer the second question first. In a way, American Jews are different than other diaspora Jewish communities. You can even go to our ally to the north in Canada and see a very different dynamic at play there. Canadian Jews are not nearly as attached to the Canadian left. They don't have the same history. I think American Jews decided a long time ago that the right wing was more dangerous than the left wing, and they saw themselves as allies in the civil rights struggle. And there's a deep-seated psychological need among American Jews to remain aligned with the left. Look, for a lot of American Jews, they see like an Alex Jones style figure as really scary, right? Now, I understand that Alex Jones doesn't represent the right, but there are aspects of the MAGA right that are very scary to a lot of American Jews, and so it continues to sort of entrench their political identities on the left, even if there are problems on the left. This may reverse some of that, though, because it's just so stunning, and I think people are genuinely shell-shocked. Even Jewish leftists who are starting to complain, like, couldn't you have at least expressed a little compassion toward Israelis after that? Like, they were shell-shocked themselves. So I think this could be a bit of a wake-up call. It might present some new dynamics to the situation. To what degree have American Jewish organizations, mainstream organizations, become captured? I think it's complicated. Look, American Jews in general, and many of the Jewish organizations that I've been part of, and I've been a part of many of the mainstream organizations, to varying degrees have a deep classical liberal core. Like, they debate issues. Like, that is part of their culture. There's this idea in Judaism called machloket l'shem shamayim, arguments for the sake of heaven, that really is part of who we are as a tradition. And the idea that we would shut down debate over key social questions is completely antithetical to Jewish life, but it's exactly what wokeism demands. And so I think that a lot of Jewish organizations are going to have trouble with this, because on the one hand, they desperately want to remain aligned with the civil rights community, with progressive forces in their community. And on the other, they realize that this is antithetical to the free expression of ideas,
Mhm.
and it puts those two values, those two interests against each other. And then comes along October 7th, 2023, and they see how batshit crazy the left can be. They see it in two ways. The first are sort of what I would call the hardcore decolonizers. And these are the people who have no subtlety at all. They just like outright,
Yeah,
congratulated on Hamas for their victory.
right.
And then you have sort of the mealy-mouthed presidents of universities, I'm sure we're going to talk about, and school superintendents and DEI people and others who, might have been horrified at what they saw and even expressed some of that. But because they have this script running through their heads that Jews are part of the powerful class and Muslims aren't, they
Hmm.
feel like they can't really speak clearly about this. And again, I think, and by the way, the hardcore left does not really like the softcore DEI left. They think that they're just wimps. But and the hardcore left is deeply influential. I mean, they're the ones who have promulgated these ideas in universities that have then created their own form of this in the corporate sector and elsewhere. And I think that's what you have. You have sort of one that's the hardcore left, which is deeply anti-capitalist and believes you have to overturn the whole system, and then the sort of soft core left,
Right.
which is trying to integrate this into capitalism and wants to take advantage of it economically and the rest. So you have this DEI industry that functions very well within a capitalist system. And
Hmm.
and they're not exactly, I think, that's why I try to be a little bit, I try to delineate there because they don't sound exactly like each other, even
Hmm.
though they're influenced by the same ideological trends. So I think in the Jewish community, you have groups that I think have gone off the deep end. I like to say that they've signed on the dotted line of deference. They've decided that they're not qualified to have an independent opinion on these issues of racial justice. They hire a DEI director or something like that, or bring in a consultancy, and now they don't have any room to maneuver because they're that clear on where they were going. And I've heard this from people. I think a lot of other institutions sort of made half-hearted commitments to this. They said all the quote unquote right things about systemic racism in the wake of George Floyd, but they didn't sort of bury themselves in these commitments. And I think some of those are at play. And sometimes there are different branches of the same institution that have different attitudes about this. So if you look at the ADL, for example,
Hmm.
I think the ADL does have some core liberal values and has some constituencies. Like, by the way, same with the ACLU. There are still people in the ACLU that are fighting the good fight for, the traditional view of civil liberties, but
Yeah.
they've been overwhelmed by
Right.
their sort of woke progressive wing. The ADL has also a woke progressive wing in its educational work. It has programs like Disrupting Bias that I
Hmm.
think are just way, way woke. And I
Yeah.
think, and I've accused them, and I know these are harsh words, of fighting on both sides of the war on anti-Semitism, because on the one hand they're fighting the leftist version, like Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO, says some very
Right.
pointed things about what he's saying, and he's been amazing on TV in the last 2 weeks.
Right.
But
Yeah.
he also has a branch of his own organization that's been promulgating some of these ideas that I think creates the conditions on which this grows out of. So I think these organizations have to face their internal tensions and their cognitive dissonance. And I'm
Yeah.
hoping that this set of events, has some silver lining in them.
Yeah. Okay, there's a lot to tease out there because there's a couple things I want to emphasize a little bit more before we start talking more about the university reactions, because I do want to get your take on the university leadership, their reactions to everything, and kind of more specifically what the future holds for these institutions, especially when we see Jewish communities now having to confront the cognitive dissonance between the stuff that they've been supporting and promulgating versus the reactions and results that they're seeing today with regards to Hamas. But you've mentioned something a couple of times, and I do want to just kind of bring this up because I think it's interesting. The lived experience idea. So this Jewish deference to DEI, to let them take on the moral questions of racism and racial issues, because, and this is something I talk a lot to students about, that because there's an issue with people when they debate, when they have these critical conversations about objective truths, like trying to seek that truth, trying to actually tease something out or a policy issue, but then immediately saying that well, I know this is to be true because of my experience, or because I am a Palestinian, for example, and I've seen it firsthand. And then suddenly the authority that lived experience takes in the discussion completely derails the debate. You can no longer have an objective conversation because now it's all based on one individual's personal experiences, and you're not talking about the bigger issue anymore. So tell me more about kind of this deference and kind of what your thoughts are on all that.
Yeah, I've written a lot about this as well. I wrote a piece in Persuasion about this. It's sometimes called standpoint epistemology or standpoint positionality. Your standpoint gives you unique knowledge. I like to say, like, some of these ideas that emerge out of wokeness have some validity, but they're taken to extremes where all of a sudden they ripen into dogma. So of course, having lived experience of something or having a certain position on something can give you some insights that others don't have. So look, I grew up in Columbus, Ohio in the 1970s and 80s. When I was in high school, I experienced a lot of anti-Semitism, like a lot of coins thrown at my feet or swastikas in my books and the like. So I'd like to think that people would want to hear me out on my lived experience with anti-Semitism. That said, there are a lot of other Jews who have a totally different experience. And so I don't know why my experience should be prejudiced in the public conversation over their experience. And moreover, lived experience is not the only data point. So when the Pew survey in 2019 shows that on average, Americans think that, or Americans admire American Jews more than any other religious community, that's a data point as well, just as lived experience is a data point. And it can't be the only data point. Lived experience can't be the only data point. And that's really where the conversation breaks down. And we've got to push back against it. The idea that one's lived experience gives one unique knowledge that should shut down the conversation. It's ridiculous. I mean, it's just utterly ridiculous. And it is the root cause of cancel culture, because it's weaponized to say, if you don't agree with my understanding of systemic racism or whatever else, that means that you're talking from a place of privilege. And talking from a place of privilege means that you don't have the lived experience to justify your perspective. So that's where we've really got to push back against some of these people, and to train students to understand why that's just such faulty logic.
Right, absolutely. Okay, one more thing I want to chat about before we dig into some of the universities and the institutions is we were talking about other institutions, like some of these organizations like the ADL, which is the Anti-Defamation League for those who don't know, and seeing again like how they have programs that support far left, radical, extreme, like woke dogmas, but then also are now seeing how maybe they're not seeing. I don't know. I'm kind of curious your thoughts. Are they actually making the connections here? Is the cognitive dissonance getting teased out? Or how are these institutions going to cope and react to this? You saw Greenblatt, like you mentioned, on CNN, where he talks about how the like people are supporting the destruction of Jewish people. But is there a connection here that they're supporting programs and ideas that are leading to their own demise? Because I think
that's our argument with them. Like, my organization exists to help them connect the dots. And there's fierce opposition to them connecting the dots, sometimes among their own team, sometimes in the broader Jewish community. There are people who say, you cannot connect the dots. That will hurt us. That will harm us by connecting the dots, by making the argument you make that there's a relationship between this ideology that makes me feel connected to what's happening on the left and what's happening to us at the same time. It's very hard. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance on this. And I say, you don't have to agree with me. Just let's talk about it. Let's hear the arguments, because a lot of people secretly agree that it's a problem. Jonathan Greenblatt from the ADL and others talk openly about what happens on the right, the ideological underpinnings of the right. So he talks about the right, I think aptly, as like a hurricane, and anti-Semitism on the left like climate change. So on the right, it's very fast moving, it's violent and so forth. It's what you saw at Squirrel Hill when 11 Jews were murdered in a synagogue. And on the left, it's what we see from woke ideology that I think we've seen a little bit of hurricane on the left too in this past 10 days as well.
Yeah, I'd say a lot of hurricane.
A lot of hurricane. Katrina here. But And I think though, in general, though, it's a pretty good analogy. But the problem is, we talk about the ideological underpinnings of anti-Semitism on the right, like the Great Replacement theory, blood libel, and so forth. But we don't talk about the ideological CO2 emissions that produce the anti-Semitism on the left. That somehow is beyond the pale. And I think that's a real blind spot in the Jewish world. The challenge for people like me is to sort of legitimize that conversation.
Right.
To give and to create critical mass around that conversation so that more and more mainstream Jews are able to say, guys, I'm sorry, we must have this conversation because we can't fight anti-Semitism that we don't properly understand.
Well, the interesting thing is some of the stuff you just brought up, I'm seeing a lot of those talking points on the far left now. The blood libel, like all that stuff is like, especially even more so now, but all the anti-Israel rhetoric, which is expressed by the left, they're using almost identical talking points as the anti-Semites of the historical far right.
There's something called horseshoe theory, which is the idea the farther that you go in one direction, the more you end up the other. I think they're also cyclical too. Like the more extreme the left gets with its identity politics and assertions of grievances in the public sphere, the more that a white person from a poor community doesn't want to be called privileged, is going to start to identify not as an American, but as a white person, and to start to develop a similarly sounding identity politics of whiteness that I think is quite dangerous itself. And so I think that I'm making the argument, guys, if for no other reason, quit this extreme identity politics, because it's actually producing a reaction on the right that you should fear.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's definitely creating reactions on the right that are certainly more extreme than the right has ever looked before. And what I think is, so I want to get back a little bit just to the cognitive dissonance, because what I find most fascinating is I'm sure you saw this like not too long ago. I think it was either Black Lives Matter or one of these kind of more woke institutions put out a pyramid of privilege. And on the very top of that pyramid, they put the Jewish people. And so how are groups like ADL or AIPAC, again, like how is it so easy for them to just ignore and like toe the line of the left when the left is being pretty blatant about their anti-Semitic views?
Yeah, so the way that this usually happens is that the mainstream Jewish organization will make peace with the ideology as long as it doesn't directly implicate Jews. So, for example, let's say you have a school district in California that wants to teach liberated ethnic studies, and they're teaching this ideology around settler colonialism. If you explicitly mention Israel as a settler colonial state, they'll go ballistic. And they'll push back as hard as you possibly can. But if you want to teach settler colonialism in general, well, that's not explicitly anti-Semitic, and we don't want to get involved in the culture wars. Wow. And that's a problem. Like you're conditioning people to think in a certain way. And trust me, guys, if you're going to think about if the only idea you impart about why the world is the way it is settler colonialism, then people are going to draw the conclusions themselves that Israel is a settler colonial state. And I think that's the blind spot here, and that's how it gets played out a lot. So they'll be okay with the ideology because they want to make peace with the left. And I like to point out a counterexample on the right, like do a thought experiment. I said, let's say a school system, in a red state or red school district, wanted to have an American First curriculum that was very much sort of replacement theory. And the original draft of that implicated Jews. It said that Jews were working behind the scenes to bring in immigrants to replace ordinary Americans. And you fought and you fought and you fought. And they said, okay, we'll drop the Jews, but we're going to still teach the American First curriculum. Are you going to be comfortable with that? And of course, they wouldn't be comfortable with that. Right. But they will be comfortable when it's settler colonialism. Unfortunately, too many of them. That's the fight we're trying to fight. No, I'm sorry, guys. It's not okay to go along with the settler colonialist curriculum either. Yeah,
absolutely. So, okay, let's talk a little bit more about what's happening on campuses today. So I'm curious to get just your thought, your reaction, first off, to university leadership's inability to just just upfront condemn terrorist activity. Like, why did they struggle with this so much? I'd love to get your take on that. But additionally, let's talk a little about the DEI double standard, right? Which is, they have these policies on campus. Oftentimes they'll enforce it against students on the right and say speech is violence. If you say a man is a man and a woman is a woman, and those can't exchange with one another, then, suddenly that's violent speech and you're causing mental harm to students, and that's restricted on campus. But then, if you're calling for literal violence against the people, that's suddenly protected speech. So can we tease out the differences there in the double standard, but then also maybe touch on the free speech laws in this country? But then again, yes, also I want to hear your response to some of the lack of leadership on the university campuses on this front too.
Yeah. So if universities have been truly institutionally neutral on all of these questions, I'd be completely down with that. If you said, listen, if a university president had said, we're not going to take a position on Black Lives Matter, we're not going to take a position on Ukraine, we're not going to take a position on anything political because we're in the education business, and they don't want to then take a position on Israel, that's cool. That's fine. That's not what they do, right? Like Yuval Levin, who's at the American Enterprise Institute, likes to talk about how institutions have become platforms for performance and they don't stay in their lane. So, I'd much prefer them not to be in the politics business at all. Just as like I don't want synagogues to be in the politics business. I want institutions to do what they're good at for the most part, right?
Right.
And yet, if they're going to be in that lane, and they're going to opine about everything, and then 1,500 Israelis get slaughtered and taken captive in the most brutal fashion you can imagine, we expect you to speak out clearly about that as well. And so there is a tremendous double standard. It's amazing how all of a sudden these university presidents have found their footing on institutional neutrality and free speech. My namesake, David E. Bernstein, the professor at George Mason, sort of hinted to me that maybe if we press back on this and force ourselves into the sort of intersectional conversation, and they have to have one standard, maybe that's what will actually finally get them to be, true advocates of free speech, because they don't want to include our narrative in the mix. They don't want to have to be forced to be equal. So we should just force them to treat Jews just like everyone else. And this is really where, as a free speech advocate and a opponent of anti-Semitism, where my sort of values sometimes live in tension, I'd rather a university president allow all kinds of speech, including, a really racist group to come to campus, but they won't. They're not going to do that. They treat Jews as differently than they do these other perceived protected groups. And as a result, then I have to say, okay, do I value equal protection more than I do freedom of expression? For me, the answer is no. For me, the answer is I worry that if a campus can become a place where Ben Shapiro can't speak, then that's the kind of place that will produce anti-Semitism. So I'd rather err on the side of free expression and political commitments around freedom of expression than I would around trying the best we can to get equal protection. And so we're treated as a protected minority, and therefore anything that we say about a hostile environment is taken seriously by the university.
Right. No, I completely agree. I mean, first of all, I think a lot of folks do forget how broad our free speech protections are in this country, and that's on purpose, because a long time ago, and one of the things that honestly has made America exceptional is we decided that free speech, free expression was more important to us than worrying about how other people felt about that speech. And so that is something that has been, continuously reinforced in our judiciary process. The Supreme Court has ruled time and time again that there's no hate speech, and this was unanimously, hate speech or offensive speech exception to the First Amendment. And that's because, like you said, what it will lead to is discriminatory enforcement. You'll get, and this is kind of what we're seeing universities try to grapple with is, look, they don't necessarily follow the rules that they enforce on their campus are not the law of the land. A lot of the times they're going to create policies against microaggressions, which are going to target students' constitutionally protected speech. But if it's a private school or whatnot, they can kind of skirt around the legal questions here. But what they'll do is, when they have a broad policy like that, they'll just enforce it, like we said earlier, on this kind of double standard method where they'll say like, look, we're going to enforce it based on the speech we disagree with, and we won't enforce it on the speech we agree with. And that's what ends up happening when you have these very subjective and broad terms used when it comes to like speech regulation.
Yeah, and I would mostly oppose those, yet it's still galling when they're applied one way with another minority and they're not applied to protect my minority community,
Yes.
and that Jewish kids on campus are genuinely being, are facing hostility from their fellow students. And you have what is equivalent to a Klan rally on a campus that basically, supports what Hamas did to Israelis. This is before Israel had even dropped the bomb on Gaza, and they're already celebrating it. And they have the hand glider meme and celebrating these brave people on the hand gliders who then go and murder people at a
civilian
concert.
Innocents.
Yeah, exactly. It's disgusting. I mean, that is to me morally equivalent to a Klan rally. So
it is.
So I'm and that's where I'm asking myself these questions. Okay, what do you do in that environment that protects both the constitutionality of free speech and also the culture of free speech that you want in universities? And I think if universities aren't going to go with the sort of everything goes on campus, and they're not right now, I think I would say, university president, you have free speech too.
Right.
And you can exercise your own free speech and condemn that.
Exactly.
You don't have to show institutional neutrality on these questions. Now, let's say, like at University of California, Santa Cruz, you have two of your centers that are supporting the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism conference that's coming to your campus, which is really, an attack on the Jewish right to have a state of their own.
Right.
And you're the university president that's problematic. And you say it, by the way, you say, we don't like this. Okay, maybe not in the explicit terms that we'd like, but they say, we don't like this. But what do? Do you then force your centers to cut ties with the program? I think you can. I don't think Penn had to allow the University of Penn Library to be a sponsor of that Palestine Writers Festival when you had all these, blatant anti-Semites coming to town. They could play host to it. They could rent space to it. But that doesn't mean that they have to have any part of their university endorsing it. And what happens when a university department, let's say the gender studies department, as it did a few years ago, endorses the boycott movement toward Israel? Like, does a university department have freedom, have academic freedom? I mean, I don't think that they do. I think an individual professor has academic freedom, but not a university department. So I think those are the kind of interventions that we could look at. University presidents can ask themselves, and I don't think they're doing a very good job. All of a sudden, they become great purists on free speech and then apply it in absurd ways.
Oh yeah, because the university will sponsor and represent all of these DEI initiatives on campuses, all of these briefings on, transgenderism and other woke ideas, but they suddenly won't sponsor things like pro-life rallies, which, for example, Georgetown used to have an annual pro-life rally, but they canceled it when the students were trying to hold it right around the time, I think it was, I want to say 2020, around that time period, maybe a little earlier. But anyway, my point in saying all of this is I think you're absolutely right. Look, there's nothing barring a university leader from saying that they condemn something or that they support something. They don't have to certainly they can take institutional neutrality, but neutrality requires you can't be biased one day and then suddenly be neutral when the opposing view is being represented. You're either neutral or you're not. So because universities have basically shirked any kind of neutral position, and they've decided that they are going to take more left-leaning positions, they can easily come out and take any other position they want. So yeah, like you said, don't sponsor, they don't have to be the direct sponsors of these types of pro-Hamas rallies or events. The departments can be, they could forbid departments from sponsoring these types of things. Leadership could actually go out there and hold even their own rally if they wanted to, for a pro-Israel rally. Sure. If they really wanted to take a position on this, there's literally nothing stopping them from doing this. But so what I find fascinating is their difficulty to condemn just easy decisions to condemn terrorist activity because of how much they fear the woke mob. And I'm curious if you think it is mostly out of fear, or if you think these leaders are completely 100% bought in and they are on the side of the pro-Hamas Palestinians.
I think it's I think that it's both, and it probably depends on the person you're talking about. Not just pro-Palestinian, but they have that script that I talked about running through their brains that I talked about earlier of like
Yeah.
who's a marginalized community and who's not. And there's no question there are complicated political dynamics. The Jewish Community Relations Council in my area, Montgomery County, Maryland, took umbrage at the school superintendent of Montgomery County Public Schools for issuing some mealy-mouthed statement, not even issuing any statement.
Right.
There's 100,000 Jews in Montgomery County. Now, the interesting thing is the school system went through this anti-racist audit, and they started implementing a gender studies program that got the Muslim community up in arms. And there were something like 1,500 Muslims at a protest there, and they continue to protest the enforcement of this new gender studies program in Montgomery County, where they're not being allowed to opt out of the class if they wish.
Right.
And so now you can imagine if you're that superintendent who refused to allow the opt-out provision on gender, now being pressured by the Jewish community to condemn in no uncertain terms Hamas, and you're now stuck because you now don't want to make the Muslim community even angrier. So I think that there's some interesting dynamics around that, that are also political in nature. You don't want to face your faculty senate or whatever else who has different opinions. Why are you siding with them? This is against our interests or whatever. And so they've got it coming from different directions. It's just that we expect if institutions are going to speak out on certain social issues, and there's something that's as eventful as this was, and as morally appalling as it was, we expect them to be on our side at that point. Yeah. And they couldn't bring themselves to do it, and we're going to hold them accountable for that. And I think for a lot of Jewish university donors, and we've seen a bunch of articles and announcements of Les Wexner just pulled his money out of Harvard, and several other key funders at Penn are pulling their money out and so forth. I think they understand now that it's not just about their unwillingness to support Jews in their time of need, but it's about the illiberal environments that they made. Mark Rowan, who wrote the piece of the Free Press about this, he's the chair of the board of the Wharton School. Right. So, I sat by while these ideas and these ideologies were sort of ingrained into our university life and did nothing about it. And this is what it's produced. Right. And so I think that is the key insight. And that is what we want to urge in the days ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the Wharton School, this is a business school that offers concentrations in DEI and ESG. So he was on the chair of that board. That's interesting. I'm gonna have to look that up because I'm very curious to see him kind of walking all that back. So what is the solution? So, to kind of wrap us up here, what can be done? How can Jews square the circle? Because as you've mentioned, they're kind of between a rock and a hard place in a lot of ways. Political leadership's between a rock and a hard place on the left. You've seen Chuck Schumer coming out condemning stuff, and then you see Rashida Tlaib and obviously supporting Hamas and the lies that are being perpetrated. But how's the Democratic Party? How does the left? How does the Jewish left? How does everyone kind of figure this out? Do you see kind of a mass exodus from the left from these various groups, or do you see them just kind of rewriting the playbook?
Yeah, it's probably going to be ambiguous a bit. What I'm hoping is that this creates a permission structure within the center left mainstream community to discuss these issues and to start thinking clearly about them. So at least it disempowers the voices that want to shut it down. That's number one. Number two, I think more and more American Jews are going to ask themselves the question, who should our allies be? And by the way, it doesn't mean that you have to lurch all the way to the right. There are all these Asian American groups that come here that don't want, their gifted and talented programs to be eradicated. And there are Black parents who don't want their kids to be taught that the system is rigged against them. There are allies. We know those people, those allies, people who fought against the San Francisco School Board and got them recalled, 3 members of the school board recalled, are not radicals. They're moderates. They're political moderates, center-left people very often. They just came to this country. They're immigrant who came to this country and don't want the country they fled to sound like the country they fled from. Yeah. And I think American Jews can make common cause with a lot of those groups and see themselves as part of a new coalition. I'm trying to get that opportunity in the front of the mind of more and more Jewish leaders. So I think the dynamics could change if more and more billionaires like we saw at Penn and Harvard start to push back. If more and more leaders insist that we're going to have the conversation, if more and more people start on their own talking about it, even if on the farther left who are not going to, join my organization, start to say, we have a problem here, guys. It just sets the culture in a different direction. And I am hoping that's where we're going.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see how this eventually plays out. I don't think it's I think what we've seen is just, it's so covered on social media now and by most media sources that I don't see this going away quietly. I do think that we're going to see some fundamental changes. At least that's my hope, honestly, because like you said, there has been a lot of problems now that we're seeing essentially the culmination of being teased out of the far left's movement in the Jewish community. So I look forward to kind of seeing what that produces and what that looks like at the end. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. David, that was a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed having you on. We're going to have you back on to continue covering this issue, because I don't think unfortunately, I don't think the anti-Semitism on college campuses is going away anytime soon. But I think it's important that we cover what's happening on these institutions, especially for those who are not tracking it closely, so that we don't have to wait for incidents like this to see everything explode out of the blue on campuses. So we can continue keeping an eye on it. All right, everyone. Well, I'm Cherise Trump, and David, that was well said.
Thanks.